Financial markets today roiled by Donald Trump and the chaos he has unleashed on the American economy. The Dow is down more than 2%, around 900 points today, after Trump, in an interview on Fox News, refused to rule out a recession. Watch those comments.
Are you expecting a recession this year?
I hate to predict things like that. There is a period of transition because what we're doing is very big. We're bringing wealth back to America. That's a big thing. And there are always periods of, it takes a little time. It takes a little time. But I think it should be great for us. I mean, I think it should be great.
Should be great. Markets didn't think so, clearly disagreeing with that. Spooked by what Trump called there a, quote, period of transition. All major stock indices are now below the levels they were when Donald Trump was inaugurated. That may be one reason why in that Fox interview, Trump said this, quote, "You can't really watch the stock market," end quote. A sudden about face from the kinds of things he said during his first term, when markets were his most favorite metric. Today's sell-off and investor concerns are focused around one thing, that Trump's policies, which often come with sudden and surprising reversals, is sending the economy into a recession. New York Times reports this, quote, "President Trump inherited an economy that was, by most conventional measures, firing on all cylinders. Wages, consumer spending, corporate profits were rising. Unemployment was low. The inflation rate, though higher than normal, was falling. Just weeks into Trump's term, the outlook is gloomier. The sudden deterioration in the outlook is striking, especially because it is almost entirely a result of Trump's policies and the resulting uncertainty. Tariffs and the inevitable retaliation from trading partners will increase prices and slow down growth. Federal jobs cuts will push up unemployment and could lead government employees and contractors to pull back on spending while they wait to learn their fate. Deportations could drive up costs for industries like construction and hospitality that depend on immigrant labor. A Trump-induced sell-off in the financial markets amid fears that Trump policies will cause a recession is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. NBC News White House correspondent Vaughn Hilliard is here. Also joining us, MSNBC columnist, author of the newsletter To the Contrary, Charlie Sykes is here, and chief political columnist, host of the InPolitic podcast for Puck, MSNBC national affairs analyst John Heilemann is here. Vaughn Hilliard, what is he doing?
I think it's a good question because the strategy is not exactly clear, other than President Trump and his cabinet over the weekend suggesting that there are going to be long-term gains. Of course, what are the objectives and the gains that they are seeking is difficult to exactly explain to the American public at large. And I think Kevin Hassett, his chief economic advisor yesterday, was pressed on the reasoning of some specific tariffs, and he equated the reciprocal tariffs that they plan on enacting in the weeks ahead against various countries, including allies, as being part of a trade war. But when asked about the border or about the Mexico and Canadian tariffs that the administration has implemented, he suggested they were not being implemented because of trade practices, but because of border enforcement. And so that is where you hear Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, just yesterday on Meet the Press, suggest defiantly that the U.S. was not heading toward a recession. But then hours later, you have President Trump aboard Air Force One not go as far as to be able to guarantee that, suggesting that there could be very well disturbances to the greater economy on the way. And that is where a great many promises were made by the then candidate Trump on the campaign trail in 2023 and 2024. And yet, what would the ultimate consequences of it be in 2025? And how would an administration respond to those consequences? That is the question that is before us today. One other note, though, Nicole, I think that it is important because we haven't heard from the president today responding to today's dramatic stock market drop-off. Last week, the S&P 500 dropped by 3%. And if you go back in time, in 2019, when he was in office, the stock market fell one particular day, and he blamed the Russia impeachment hoax on the stock market falling that day. And then a year ago, there was a good day on the stock market. He wasn't in office, but he said it was because Americans were expecting him to get back into office. And then you go back to last August, there was that day in which the stock market fell right after Kamala Harris had ascended to the top of the ticket. And he and his campaign went out and called it the Kamala crash. Of course, that was a one-day event, and that was not what would play out in the weeks that followed. But here we are in March of 2025, and we have heard very little from the White House in terms of how or whether they are going to seek to correct course on this, or whether the stock market's reaction to the economic decisions being made by this White House are essentially going to be short-term consequences, and they're going to continue to articulate a message that there will be long-term gains.
Steve Mnuchin seemed to have a coalition with Mr. I think Gary Cohn was in there as well, where they could speak truth to Donald Trump and stave off cataclysmic days like this for everyone who watched their retirement savings plunge, for everyone whose livelihoods are tied to America's economy, which is everyone. Does this speak to the weakness of the current economic cabinet members?
I think Howard Lutnick is, I think, been the biggest cheerleader Donald Trump could find during the cabinet meetings. He was the one who heralded the accomplishments of President Trump. And when you look at Scott Bessent, his Treasury Secretary, just on Friday, when he was asked about on CNBC about the strategy behind the tariffs being implemented and then some tariffs being rescinded, he called it an organic decision-making process, effectively acknowledging that it's an hour-by-hour, day-by-day decision coming out of the White House. And I think that that is also where I think Kevin Hassett is such an interesting figure in all of this. He was there during the first Trump administration. He was the one who is at the forefront of negotiating NAFTA 2.0, or the USMCA trade agreement, at the direction of then-President Trump. Fast forward 6 years later, it's Trump, now president again, who is seeking to have Kevin Hassett, the man who negotiated USMCA, go out and explain how the United States is getting ripped off by Mexico and Canada under the very trade agreement that he and Kevin Hassett negotiated 6 years ago. That is where it's very difficult to try to explain exactly what the goals are and the objectives are, because the individuals around him are going out onto TV, yet have struggled in a way that is starkly different than even 6, 7 years ago during the first trade war, to explain what the priorities and the mission is of the tariffs that they are placing on these American companies from bringing in these imports.
I guess what I'm trying to understand is there anyone in the cabinet who previously or prior to January 20th advocated any of the policies they're now on TV shows defending?
I mean, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, said that there would be a much more tactical, precision-type tariff policy that would be implemented by this White House. And he was somebody that was never a fan of tariffs, yet President Trump selected him to be his Treasury Secretary. And we have seen everything but a precision, tactical approach to tariffs. And we have seen him, in response, go out and defend the across-the-board sweeping tariffs that the president has directed him to enact.
Charlie Sykes, I think what Vaughn is saying is no, but weak weenies wreck economies. And the weak weenies that make up the economic advisors to Donald Trump have never on public record advocated for any of the economic policies that have been ushered in over the last 5 weeks. Your thoughts?
Well, this has been Donald Trump's obsession for decades now, right? Using tariffs to punish our trading partners, and he's unburdened by advisors who will tell him no. And so what you're seeing playing out is the world going, okay, we thought you had some clue of what you're doing, but this is disastrous. And this goes back to one of Donald Trump's obsessions back in the 1970s and the 1980s. And in the past, there have been people around him who were able to say, no, don't do this. This is not this, to pick a trade war. Nobody wins trade wars. But this is Trump unshackled, doing exactly what his id tells him. And I think you're seeing the consequences of it, that in fact he is serious. And it is interesting to see how they will respond to the markets, because I think that the markets have been generally supportive of some of the things that he's been talking about, but certainly not this. And now there's this recognition that he's going to go ahead despite the economic consequences of imposing these tariffs.
Heilman, your thoughts today?
Well, first of all, Nicole, Thank you for starting off by talking about weak weenies, something when thinking about cabinet, not something I really thought I'd ever have to contemplate.
I've got so much more where that came from.
I mean, in question.
Weak weenies wreck economies. Weak weenies also wreck NATO and aid Putin. But I don't want to get ahead of myself.
Sure. Sure. I mean, it actually plays into my favorite thing, which is alliteration. It's the weak weenies, and this is the week. Last week was the week that Wall Street woke up. A lot of alliteration from anxious analysts placed in powerful posts. Here's what I think. I think that what Charlie said is, I think what Charlie said is really important. I think, this is just of a piece with everything else we're seeing. Trump is being Trump now. And Trump, I would actually say, I agree with Charlie 100% that this is Trump unbound. This is what he wants to do. No one's going to stop him. No one's going to hold him back. The guardrails are gone. You can't blame Scott Bessent. Scott Bessent's a serious person. Peter Navarro, who's not in the cabinet, but is obviously is not really even an economist, but is also someone who's been important in Trump's thinking about economics. He's been someone who's advocated trade wars in the past and blanket protectionism. But I agree with you that there's not a long record of the people in the Economic Council, if you want to call it that, of Trump, who've advocated blanket across the board, on again, off again. We don't know what's going on. Tariffs, no one thinks that's a good idea. But here's the reality is that Trump has been a mercantilist and a protectionist his entire life. He has, as a businessman, throughout his whole career, this is the stuff he has said. He said it back in the 1980s. He said it in the 1990s. He said it in the 2000s. He thinks that somehow there is that going back to an older version of the economy that doesn't exist anymore. He wants to basically roll back globalization and try to turn America into a purely domestic market where we make stuff for Americans. Americans consume that stuff, and that is a better version of the economy than the version where the entire world is knitted into this kind of inextricable web that we're in now, where free trade over time has shown itself to be the best way forward for global prosperity and for American prosperity. Trump does not believe that. He wants to, as I said, go back to that other version. And I think it's not just his id. I think that you might call him a pea brain, but that is a thing that he has been mentally committed to for a long time. It's not surprising.
So Henrietta, Kevin Hassett, the director of the National Economic Council, was asked if he was concerned about a recession. Here's part of what he said.
I think that what's going to happen is the first quarter is going to squeak into the positive category, and then the second quarter is going to take off as everybody sees the reality of the tax cuts.
So does that ease concerns at all or just confuse things, given what the president said?
Honestly, it sounds like Kevin Hassett is confused. There are no tax cuts coming. The bill that they're writing right now extends existing rates. And that's the biggest part of this problem. This is a $5 trillion bill, $3 trillion of which at least is going to be deficit financed. And there's no stimulative effect. So when Trump goes on national television and he says he's, not willing to rule out a recession, it's a combination of two things that are a remarkable showing of his cards here, and that the tariffs are going on. They will be inflationary. They're taxes on American consumers. And the tax bill that they're writing is not, in fact, stimulative. It has no economic feedback because it's an extension of the status quo, almost fully financed by the deficit. So I think Kevin Hassett has got to stop calling it tax cuts when that's not what it is.
Important fact check there. All right, Jay, Canada is not backing down. Today, Ontario is adding a surcharge for electricity that's sent to some U.S. states. Justin Trudeau's successor, Mark Carney, just showed in his victory speech he's ready to take on President Trump over these tariffs. What more can you tell us about all that and about him?
Yeah, and let's start with that surcharge on the electricity, Chris. It's going to affect about 1.5 million families in the states of New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. Doug Ford, the premier of Ontario, levying that surcharge. He said it's going to cost families about $100 a month in added cost, and said at one point, if the president continues to push Canada, he won't hesitate to shut that electricity off altogether. Let's shift over to Mark Carney. He's the economist who's never held office, who won the leadership of the Liberal Party last night at their convention, calling his win with nearly 86% of the vote a mandate focused on President Trump, the tug of war over those tariffs, and a trade war that continues to intensify.
The Canadian government has rightly retaliated and is rightly retaliating with our own tariffs that will have maximum impact in the United States and minimum impact here in Canada. And my government will keep our tariffs on until the Americans show us respect. The Americans, they should make no mistake, in trade as in hockey, Canada will win.
Yeah, look, I have to tell you, we were at that convention last night. There was more talk about the White House, about the president, about the situation with the tariffs, and the suggestions of President Trump that Canada could become the 51st state than there were actually about a campaign or their party. So they are highly focused on this, and having been here for a bit, Chris, I can also tell you there's a strong surge of nationalism here in Canada. Protests outside the U.S. Embassy, a boycott of American goods. U.S. wine and liquor pulled from the shelves of government liquor stores. We know Canadians have a well-earned reputation of being kind, composed, and reserved. I can tell you right now, we're also learning that when they're pushed, when they feel like they have been embarrassed and they feel like they are getting bullied, they're very quick to stand up and push back.
Jay Gray, thank you for that. So, Henrietta, when your clients call you and they say, you know, what do you think the next few weeks or months look like? What do you say to them?
You know, it's interesting. My clients are mostly investors on Wall Street, and they're calling from various conferences saying, you know, the tide has turned. The environment is much more sour now than it was a couple months back. And that's because markets are predictive and future looking. So the stock market tumbles that you're seeing today and that you pointed out at the top of this segment are because corporations are preparing for tariffs that have not yet gone into effect. April 2nd is the off-discussed date for new tariffs to come on from everything from steel. You know, 90% of Canadian steel is going to get hit, to EU automobiles, and everything getting more expensive as we're dealing with sort of domestic and grocery prices continuing to be high from inflation. So investors are really calling to try to get a handle on how much of the exposure there is to tariffs, how much deficit financing there will be in this tax bill, and whether there is any good news on the horizon. And the answer is the tariffs are coming. They've been slow to roll out, and the full impact of the tariffs is not yet baked into the market. So there's more downside to come.
And Congressman, I read one article that said this shows us that President Trump and his administration have more tolerance for economic pain than we assumed. I think most people believe that if the markets started to go down, he would work to change that. Why not this time?
Well, it's kind of mystifying to me that President Trump is behaving so recklessly with respect to the stewardship of this economy. He is trying to undermine North American economic integration with these tariffs. Are they on or are they off? What we do know, if he does go through with this, he will likely cause recessions in Canada and Mexico and create higher prices here and disrupt manufacturing and agriculture. So that's going to be very negative for us. He's also at the same time bad-mouthing Europe every day, a major trading partner with us, the European Union, all those countries, huge amounts of investment flows between the United States and Europe and back and forth. And he just seems to, and he's talking about, you know, greater rapprochement with Russia, which has an economy smaller than some of our states. So what I'm getting out of all this is that he just seems to be rather destructive and reckless and does not understand the consequences of these tariffs on American manufacturers and also on the farmers. It's just going to have it. And businesses want predictability. They want stability. They want certainty. And they're getting none of that. This is having a chilling investment, I suspect, on investment and hiring right now. And that's why there's some softening in the economy.
So let's talk, Brian, about one of the things that Charlie just mentioned, which is agriculture, because it just started today that China is imposing tariffs on many of the farm products from the United States. China is our largest overseas market for those products. What now? What's that about?
Yeah, and that's a retaliatory tariff because the United States put in a 10% tariff in the first week of February and then another 10% last week. No exemptions on China, by the way, which were provided to Mexico and Canada as of the later part of last week. But this is really big for a lot of American agricultural exports. These are heartland farmers that make things like soybeans. They, raise pork. They raise pigs. They raise cows for slaughter. That then they ship the meat off to China. Now you have a 10 to 15% tariff on those exact types of products. products for what is a major export market for farmers here in the United States. So they're going to feel that pinch with perhaps even a cutoff in some cases as buyers in China decide to go elsewhere to source their soybeans and pork and beef and what have you. So I think that this, though, it's really alarming because you consider that President Trump promised tariffs of up to 60% on the campaign trail. This is really just the beginning of that tariff war. So any sort of farmer that's watching this thread is going, okay, well, not only are those tariffs now in effect that are impacting my business now, but this could just be the beginning of a ratcheting up of those rates of tariff.
And we know some of his biggest support came from rural areas. So, Henrietta, what do you think has to happen for the economy and the American people to get kind of to the other side of this trade war, for the economy, for at least the messaging on the economy to be a little more predictable?
Well, I think that tariffs are sort of the true north for President Trump, and they are widely supported and were a major tenet of his campaign. So what really needs to happen, you mentioned the stock market sending a message earlier, that's not moving the needle with the White House. You really need to see Republican voters start to change their mind about these tariffs. And I'm afraid that what's going to happen is it won't occur for President Trump, but it will occur for the House and Senate members who are up for re-election next year from the president's own party, especially if they're asked to codify these tariffs into their tax bill and make them permanent. Those farm state senators that we're talking about and the congressmen who are all up for re-election next year are going to bear the brunt of the 15% retaliatory tariffs from China, the $86 billion worth of tariffs that Canada is putting on next in a couple weeks as a response to these tariffs. And the feedback is, really problematic because there is not a bailout yet in the works for farmers. We know that in the first term, we got $28 billion worth of bailouts for the U.S. farmers, more than the entire auto bailout during the Great Recession. And that's something that farmers are going to have to look forward to, but they don't have yet. And I'm afraid it's going to have readout to the members in the House and Senate, if not the president.
Congressman, the Washington Post also points out this, quote, inflation slowed in Biden's final year in office, and most economists say that Trump inherited a fairly strong and stable economy. Trump pushed Biden on the stock market, inflation, and overall economy, all issues on which he's now telling voters to look the other way. So, politically speaking, are they going to be able to hang this on President Biden? Or, as Henrietta just said, are they facing a real problem come next November?
Well, look, the longer Donald Trump serves, the harder it is going to be for him to lay all this on Biden's lap. It's going to be really difficult, particularly now that he is engaging in this trade war in North America. Look, these tariffs, they will raise prices, assuming they get implemented. He's already going to implement them on steel and aluminum. We know the prices are going to go up. That will be on Donald Trump. And I don't see any way that he can somehow avoid responsibility. And of course, like, members of Congress are going home to their districts right now. And if they're smart, they're going in talking to businesses. And I guarantee you, they're going into manufacturers in their districts right now who are telling them that these tariffs are going to raise costs for them because they import things, inputs that they need to make things here in America. And this is going to be bad for manufacturing. So these members are going to hear it. Republican members are going to be the ones who are going to have to push back. When I served in Congress, most Republican members did support opening markets and lowering tariffs. This is a complete flip-flop for many members of the Republican side who have never embraced this type of AFL-CIO protectionism that the Democrats and, of course, Donald Trump are best known for.
This, of course, is related to some of the new reporting, Tyler, that you've been doing. The new piece you co-authored for the New York Times focuses on the growing tensions within MAGA world, carrying the headline, "The Populist versus the Billionaire, Bannon, Musk in the battle within MAGA." Fight here, of course, about globalists and how they view the economy. That's part of it. You write in part this: the long-standing animus between Mr. Bannon and Mr. Musk encapsulates a key tension at the heart of Mr. Trump's Make America Great Again movement. It pits those, like Mr. Bannon, who want Mr. Trump to carry out a more fully populist agenda against ultra-wealthy interests, epitomized by Mr. Musk, who occupy key positions in the president's orbit. Mr. Trump has made clear he wants to keep both men and their allies within his movement, but Mr. Bannon's vocal disdain for Mr. Musk has been noticed by the president. In mid-February, the president told Mr. Bannon that he wanted him to lay off the attacks on Mr. Musk and for the two men to sit down privately. That's according to two people familiar with the comments. That meeting has not happened yet. It's not clear when or if it will. So, Tyler, we know that Bannon, still an outside advisor to the president. They speak occasionally. His War Room podcast is listened to by many in the West Wing. It seems like he's pulled his punches on Musk. He's hit him a couple times, but not the full-throated way that we know Steve Bannon can when he wants to go after someone. So tell us a little bit more here about the state of this relationship. Do we think that meeting's ever going to happen?
Yeah, that's a big question, John, and it's unclear that it will. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about this relationship and this fight between the two of them is what it tells us about Donald Trump and the broader Republican Party and the movement and Trump's effort to try to keep both of these sort of opposite poles inside the coalition, inside the tent, and sort of tamp down on these attacks. But, as you noted and read from the piece, these two men have vastly different views. And one of them, I think, comes down to sort of the ideological drive of them. Steve Bannon has been preaching about populism for many years, has sort of been at the vanguard of that movement to move the Republican Party in that direction. Elon Musk is not somebody who was even a Republican a few years ago, definitely not a Trump supporter. During the first term, I heard from people that heard directly from Elon Musk, who was very critical of Trump's approach on tariffs, on sort of his disdain for the globalization and the global economy that many of Elon Musk's businesses depend on. Now we've obviously seen this full transition of Musk into someone that is a full-throated Donald Trump supporter. And so it's just interesting to observe this dynamic unfold, particularly against the backdrop of the economics that we're talking about here and how, Trump's tariff policy is going to impact billionaires like Elon Musk, who are quite concerned about not just investment, but the stock market as well, which, as many guests have mentioned, is a huge concern of Donald Trump. He ran in 2024 on this economic argument, blaming Joe Biden for inflation, blaming Joe Biden for a whole cost for inflated goods across the board. And so as we see costs go up here in America, it'll be quite interesting to see not just how Donald Trump responds, but how Republican politicians and their voters respond as well.
It's crazy, John Heilman, that we just showed a picture of Donald Trump, Elon Musk in the background, and J.D. Vance. And you feel like asking, which one of these do not belong? Because you had J.D. Vance a couple of years ago in his little Silicon Valley vest talking about how much he loved San Francisco and Silicon Valley. And, multinational, globalist. The same thing with Elon Musk. And so the friction here isn't just made up. This isn't just like somebody trying to gain power. I can think of few people less suited to help run the MAGA movement than the two I mentioned, like Elon Musk. I mean, the whole populist fight is against globalists, billionaires, multinational corporations, monopolies, which a lot of these tech companies now basically are monopolies. And they don't believe in nationalism. They believe they are bigger than any nation, that they are their own standalone nation state. So again, I'm just not sure how these two forces are balanced in the MAGA universe moving forward.
Well, look, I mean, Joe, that tension between, which is embodied by the tension between Elon Musk and Steve Bannon, who've been fighting publicly and in some cases viciously now since December, when the first kind of debate about H-1B visas came out. It became clear that Elon Musk was like every other person in Silicon Valley who believes deeply in immigration, especially for high-skilled workers, and Steve Bannon, who wants to basically stop all immigration in the United States. They started fighting then. The tension has ebbed and flowed in public, but in private, it's been intense. And this reporting by Maggie and Jonathan Swan that put Elon on his back foot, Bannon immediately seized on that. I think this is in the long run, this is one of the great tensions governing the Trump 2.0 era, and also about kind of the key choices that Trump has to make. And I got to say, but Elon Musk is an incredibly rich guy, although he's getting less rich by the day. The man has lost $180 billion off of his net worth.
Whoa.
As the Tesla shares have tanked. That's even big money to you, Joe. $180 billion in net worth. That's some serious business there. And like as that has started to happen, Bannon, he's very rich. He's got control of X. Those are big assets to Donald Trump. But I got to say, how long Elon Musk is going to want to continue to see people attacking Tesla dealerships around the country, lighting Tesla charging stations on fire, painting swastikas on the sides of Tesla dealerships, and seeing the stock price plummet that way, impacting his personal wealth. I don't know. And the other thing I know is you never count out Steve Bannon in one of these fights because he is the embodiment of the MAGA base. And without the MAGA base, there is no Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, I don't know if Donald Trump would say that, but yeah, don't count out Steve Bannon in a fight over, what lies at the heart of MAGA. And Tyler, I'm just curious. Of course, the vandalism at the Tesla dealerships absolutely horrifying. It's terrible and should be condemned. And I don't think stockholders of Tesla are as concerned about that as they are about the fact that his politics is really getting in the way of his bottom line. You look at I guess in Germany and France, sales have plummeted by 75%. His stock has fallen 45% over the past month since he really started getting involved in the Doge activities. His approval ratings plummeting, especially among younger Americans. How much longer is he going to stay in this fight?
That's the question a lot of people in Washington, Joe, are asking. And it's interesting. I've talked to some close Bannon allies and acolytes to write this story. And one of the things that some of them told me was that they saw maybe some benefit in Elon Musk as sort of a heat shield for Donald Trump, that a lot of the animus and criticism would be targeted at Elon Musk, and he would be able to carry out some of the president's agenda without the president taking a hit in terms of his own approval rating. I think the meeting that my colleagues Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan reported on last week about the contentious meeting between Elon Musk and the cabinet secretaries that John just mentioned showed that maybe that heat shield idea is not working as well as some of these Republicans had hoped for, and that the negativity and the criticism directed at Elon Musk is reflecting poorly on Republicans. We've seen Republicans shy away from town halls across the country because of some of these, outbursts from constituents who are very concerned about the cuts to government services that they're already seeing. So I think, obviously we know Donald Trump is very concerned about his approval rating, his poll numbers, and it seems unlikely that he will allow Elon Musk to hurt his own brand and politics. We've seen sort of this, Donald Trump trying to tamp down on any concern or speculation that there's fighting between the cabinet. We saw he had a meal with Marco Rubio and Elon Musk over the weekend at Mar-a-Lago, trying to push back against the idea that there's dissension among his top aides. But it is very clear that Elon Musk is having an impact on Donald Trump's presidency, and how long Donald Trump will be able to withstand that is a big open question.
New York Times White House reporter Tyler Pager, thank you. His new reporting, of course, online right now, and Tyler's new book, 2024, How Trump Retook the White House and the Democrats Lost America, comes out in July. Tyler, thank you.
And just for the record right now, this morning, Jonathan Lemire passed along to me. Right now, Marco Rubio and Elon Musk texting are tweeting sweet nothings to each other on X. How exciting. I want to ask two people on this show that actually know an awful lot about economics, about where the investing class is on Donald Trump. Steve Ratner last week wrote a piece in the New York Times saying, while they're concerned about some of the chaos, most of his business friends still are supportive of Donald Trump. But you look at the front page of the Wall Street Journal, wary investors are starting to play defense. We're reading it absolutely everywhere, concerned about the growing chaos. Andrew, what are you hearing on the street?
Oh, I think there's absolutely a wariness. I mean, the question is this a temporary situation, as the president has tried to describe, or is this a longer-term issue where we could, as Zanny said, move into a recession? That is where we are right now, which is if these tariffs, I think, continue apace and the uncertainty remains, it's almost impossible to see this not turn down. If things reverse themselves and maybe, Trump does all sorts of other things to try to boost the economy, which I think is still a possibility, things could go the other way. So I don't think people know necessarily, but, Trump is right about this. In the short term, there is going to be pain.
That is certainly true, Andrew. I'm probably slightly more pessimistic than you are, in that I think everything we've seen in the last few weeks of how he behaves is that he can't resist the tariffs as threats of them, as tools of threats, and he believes in them. So I think there's going to be uncertainty. Even if there isn't a barrage on April 2nd, we won't know if there'll be more after that. I think this is not something that's going to go away. And I think that uncertainty, coupled with an even greater degree of uncertainty on his foreign policy, which we haven't talked about, but which for those of us in Europe is really freaking us out, means that I think people are generally, the uncertainty has soared about the U.S. economy. And so that's one of the reasons why people are taking their money out. Foreigners.
Editor-in-chief of The Economist, Zanny Minton Beddoes, and CNBC's Andrew Ross Sorkin. Thank you both very much for coming on the show this morning.
President Trump is denying there are tensions between his cabinet members and Elon Musk over the actions taken by Musk's Department of Government Efficiency.
I don't think the tensions are high. Look, Elon's a very special person, and these cabinet people are special people. These are very successful people, or they wouldn't have gotten, they've attained the highest heights of government. And I think they have a fantastic relationship to Elon. And Doge has been incredible.
Comments come after the New York Times reported tensions boiled over between Musk and Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy during a cabinet meeting last week. This, as the New York Times also reports, tensions are growing between Musk and another key figure in Trump's movement, former White House chief strategist Steve Bannon. With us now, New York Times White House correspondent Tyler Pager. Tyler, thank you. You are also the author of the upcoming book 2024, How Trump Retook the White House and Democrats Lost America. Tyler, is there anything to this continuing narrative that there is major tension between Trump, some of his cabinet members, and Elon Musk?
Yeah, I think it's, important. As you noted, my colleagues Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan reported on this explosive meeting inside the White House last week where the cabinet officials really went after Elon Musk and said, the work that he's doing does have some consequences. I think the precursor to some of this is a lot of Republicans in Congress are having challenges with town halls as their constituents raise concerns about the work of Doge. One of the things that the Republicans and the Trump administration is dealing with is implementing this idea, which a lot of people in theory agree with, of trying to cut government waste and spending. But how exactly do you go about doing it? Elon Musk has this slash and burn practice that he's implemented at the other companies he's taken over, like X, formerly known as Twitter, where really he just comes in and fires a whole bunch of people. With the government, there are obviously consequences to that. And so it is clear that there has been some pushback, some resistance, some frustration even from not just Trump's cabinet, but also Republican members of Congress over this approach and what its implications are for Americans around the country.
And in a post on X this morning, Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced 83% of programs are canceled at the U.S. Agency for International Development and thanked Doge for his help in achieving its goals. What should we make of this?
Yeah, I think that post on X was quite interesting. If you'll note there, one of the things Secretary Rubio said in that comment was that after a 6-week review process, he was trying to make clear that this was a process that was, intentional, and they really thought through exactly which programs they were going to cut. Obviously, that stands in contrast to some of the ways the USAID cuts were made. We saw Elon Musk's Doge crew go in and just basically shut down the entire agency. Also, I think what's interesting here is Marco Rubio taking credit for that decision, sort of laying it out a little bit more cleanly than, the way that we've seen Doge go about its work so far. Obviously, we also know, as Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary, told reporters this weekend, President Trump had dinner with Marco Rubio and Elon Musk. Clearly, the president is concerned and frustrated that this meeting has been reported by my colleagues and is trying to smooth over any of the tensions there. So it seems like they're back on that foot there. But, it is still just the early days of the Trump administration, and it'll be interesting to see how long Elon Musk stays in the good graces of not just President Trump, but the broader cabinet.
And Tyler, what's behind Steve Bannon's ongoing attacks on Musk?
Yeah, I think what's interesting here is the sort of ideological divide between these two key figures in President Trump's orbit. Steve Bannon has been preaching about populism, railing against, in his parlance, globalists and billionaires like Elon Musk. And now the movement is trying to accommodate both of these individuals. Elon Musk is someone that was not a Trump supporter. He even admitted at CPAC last month that he leaned Democrat. And so, this is a fight that is ongoing and tells us a lot about, what the future of the MAGA movement might look like.
Tyler Page, it's great seeing you. I thank you very much.
Joining us now, Senior Fellow for Middle East and African Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, Stephen Cook. So give us a little bit more about what I was just asking here. Why would the U.S. break with decades of precedent and reach out to Hamas?
Well, that's precisely what President Trump has promised to do, which is essentially break the mold. The indirect negotiations were not producing results. President Trump would like to get the Americans back. He's also stated he'd like to get all the Israelis back. And this was an effort to sort of break through the Gordian knot here, though despite the kind of optimism that Buller came out of the meeting, there really wasn't a tremendous amount of progress. The Hamas has offered something that has offered over and over again for many years, which is a 5 to 10 year ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. That's a non-starter for the Israelis, who are not looking for deals, but are looking to get their people back, and then ultimately to change the security environment for them, and that means continuing to pound away at Hamas.
How much is Israel a part of these negotiations any longer, or is Donald Trump just trying to do what he's doing with Ukraine, which is get involved and be the one to broker the peace? I mean, we talk about this. It has become something of a given now that he has his eyes on a Nobel Prize.
Yeah, I think if I was an Israeli official, I'd be very, very concerned that I was getting cut out of these negotiations, which is why, despite the Israelis very much unhappy about the fact that Buller had these direct talks with Hamas, Israelis are going to Doha and will be there when Steve Witkoff, who is the primary Middle East negotiator for the Trump administration, will be there, perhaps in an effort to protect their equities. It certainly is the case that President Trump is less concerned about Israeli sensitivities about talking to Hamas than getting some sort of deal. This is something that was likely to happen anyway. I think the people who in Israel and Israel's supporters around the world who thought that President Trump was going to support the Israelis to the hilt misread what the situation really is. And that is, as I said, President Trump is mostly interested in a deal and doesn't necessarily share the kind of ideological affinity for Israel that his predecessor did.
If they were listening to you on this program, they would have had some skepticism, as you've been pointing out. This stage 2 of this ceasefire, does it look like we're ever going to get there?
No, it doesn't look like we're going to get there. And the Israeli negotiators are there in an effort to extend phase 1. And that is what the Israelis are trying to do, both on the ground in Gaza as well as through these negotiations, is to pressure Hamas into agreeing to extending phase 1. Phase 2 has become something that Prime Minister Netanyahu can't possibly move into for fear that members of his government will bolt the government and bring down his government. So it's sort of a kabuki dance. It's a question of semantics. They will negotiate further, but they won't call it phase 2, and they won't discuss a termination of the war, which are red lines for Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition partners and, quite frankly, even members of his own party.
What's going to happen to the hostages?
That is the ongoing question, and it strikes me that without some sort of significant change, both in the Israeli political situation as well as with regard to Hamas, which has also moved the goalposts over many, many months here, those people, those who are alive, will remain in captivity, unfortunately.
All right, Stephen Cook, really good to have you. Thank you, as always.